I recall some years ago when I was wearing Indian clothes in the United States, beads and sort of a dress. I was invited by the young Turks of psychiatry to speak at grand rounds at the Einstein Medical School. And I was sitting cross-legged exclusively in those days, and I walked in and all the chairs had very narrow arms. It was a long conference table, so I saw the only place reasonably to sit, from my point of view, was the end of the conference table. It turned out that the grand rounds, they alternated a guest lecturer and a case. So that as the old Viennese psychiatrist walked in, they pulled out their papers to look. They were sure they had made an error and that I was a case. So realizing that they thought I was a case, I presented myself as a case to them. And it took them about 10 minutes to realize, because they were all nodding yes, because I was doing case study presentation, as I've done many times as a psychologist, that they were being had, that the case was presenting itself. I'm not sure what role I feel to be playing at this moment. In 1963, when the research we were doing at Harvard came up for criticism extensively, and we were attacked as being unscientific because we were doing introspective research, which was quite out of vogue in 1960, early 60s. My training was as a behaviorist at Stanford, and you were either in behaviorism or Freud. Those were the two choices, and I was in both. And I did a book called Identification and Child Rearing, which is an attempt to find operational definitions for Freudian concepts. So I was trying to make the best of both worlds, as any good politician would do. And when we came up for criticism at Harvard, I had a partner whom some of you may have heard of named Tim Leary. And Tim argued that we were doing something which in the tradition of psychology was very justifiable. We were doing introspective research because we were taking psilocybin, the psychedelic chemical, ourselves, and then building our reports on our own experiences. And just like Skinner doesn't get into his rat box, we were not supposed to get into our drug stash, but we were. So Tim argued that we were in a justifiable tradition, and I took another stance, which I think is valid even to this moment. I said to everybody, I've made a choice to let go of my scientific distance, and from now on, I would like to be considered a datum. I am something you can observe if you choose to. And I will be whatever happened to old Dick Alpert from the 60s. And all I have to do is be whatever I am. I would like to open Pandora's box and just become what I need to become, and not keep one foot in the door of the observer, because that one foot is going to cost too much from my own point of view in my own life. And maybe I will come up with some contribution, and maybe I won't. That's the risk we have to take. But I would like to be a datum. So in some sense, all you have to do today is decide whether I'm psychotic. You have to be, in a way, an observer and an experimenter. And I am the rat running down the maze, the runway. But I think that the issues today will raise some interesting questions. Is, who are you as an observer? Can you keep something called observer objectivity, and how naive has that turned out to be as a concept? And if you are really going to observe me, are you going to observe me with your heart? Are you going to observe me with the deepest parts of your being or with your conceptual structures? Where do we meet? Where do you and I meet in this? Where do I as the rat and you as the experimenter meet? Do we meet through your senses? Do we meet through any other parts of your being? How sophisticated an instrument of observation are you? And that really is part of the domain that you and I are dealing with today. What I would like first to do is to run through, in a very personal sense, the set of experiences and perceptions and shifting perceptions that confronted me with the issue of what is reality. Not in a sophisticated intellectual sense, but just in a daily life sense. And then let's see if we can pull some kinds of interesting generalizations or theoretical ideas out of that. As I said before, my training was as a behaviorist and as a Freudian, which were two. Freudian therapy was an art form, and behaviorism was hard science. And I was even part of a junta at Harvard to toughen up the social relations department and put more statistics requirements in. So I've gone a long way somewhere from then. My view at that time was that psychology, we had the best theories, and that the error was merely that what we couldn't predict was merely error due to poor methods of measurement. I had a certain kind of arrogance that was part of the zeitgeist of the intellectual community at that time. And I had learned to play the game reasonably well. The inductive, hypothetico-deductive systems and experimental and operational definitions, factor analytic techniques, so on. And all this time, or prior to this, when I was a graduate student, I had been in psychoanalysis. And I experienced that what I knew as a psychologist had not too much relevance to what I was as a human being. That I was a 9-to-5 psychologist, and that I was neurotic at 5:15, but at 4:45, I knew all the answers about everything. And the fact that I would sit in my bathtub and be depressed and neurotic was clearly outside of the veil of my professional work. I define myself in terms of my needs, my drives, my social perceptions, my attitudes, my unconscious, my psychosexual development and the interruptions thereof. There was a kind of a malaise in my being, but I interpreted this malaise as merely another neurotic pattern, not as anything to be listened to very seriously. And as I've said in other lectures, the problem I had was that I knew that I had arrived in this lofty position of being a Harvard professor of psychology through merely being a shrewd politician, not a scholar. But I assumed that the people around me were scholars. I couldn't assume they were just like me, otherwise the whole system collapsed. I mean, if everybody was a phony like I was, this was an impossible situation. So I would look into the eyes of Eric Erickson and Jerry Bruner and David Reisman and all the heavies, assuming, and I'd be constantly saying, like, do you know? I mean, because obviously what we knew as psychologists didn't have much to do with what we were. And I just assumed that was my problem. So I was asking them, do you know? And they were constantly saying, well, my research shows, but it didn't really say they knew. And it always was like a magician, look over there, and now see over there. And it was never dealing with the essence of the matter. And we'd play poker and eat ham and cheese sandwiches and drink beer and tell dirty jokes. And it was all lovely and fun, but something was missing. And religion was out for me because, as a social scientist, religion was an interesting anthropological dig of some sort. Probably, I would have had 40 more years of that, tenured and secure, just making believe I know and getting ulcers with my own deception. Had not Tim Leary taken pity on me and shared with me the mushrooms. Now, I know it's in vogue in the APA meeting every time you mention drugs to say, caution, beware, we are taking this under advisement and serious research should be done. And fortunately, I don't represent any institution, so I can tell you that psychedelics have been absolutely great for me. Now, what happened to me, many of you know from some of the things I've written or said, but for those of you that don't, let me just give you the briefest review of what I faced taking psychedelics. Now, I had had marijuana prior to this time, but it had been very mild and it hadn't upset my apple cart that much. But now here is a behaviorist, a philosophical materialist, confronting this experience. I have taken this pill that this mad Irishman has given me. I am sitting in his living room. It's dark, semi-dark. And I see somebody standing across the room about 8 feet away, and I squint to see who it is, and I realize that who I am looking at is myself. I am looking at myself, strangely enough, as a professor with a cap and gown, which I had only worn once to please my parents at one Harvard graduation. But it's clearly professorness is over there, and I think, isn't this interesting? Hallucination, right? As any good social science psychologist would think. How strange, how interesting. Apparently, I am experiencing a dissociation from one of my social roles, that of being a Harvard professor. Little did I know that was foreshadowing of future events. But at that moment, I thought, all right, well, let that go. And as I let it go, it disappeared, and I saw another being over there. And it was me with I was an airplane pilot, which I am, and it had with a helmet and goggles. I mean, all these bizarre symbolic images of these things, and each one by one, my social roles as lover, as cellist, as all of these roles, I saw and I let go. And then what I saw in the distance, in the dark, semi-darkness, was an image of some image that I recognized as who I thought myself to be beneath those social roles. It was the person that my parents would say, Richards, finish your beans, or it was that kind of root personality person. And I thought, if I give that one up, I'll probably have amnesia, and that's what this drug will do to me. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Okay, amnesia, here we go. And I let it go, and the next thought I had was, at least I have my body. And then I experienced looking down with my eyes open, sitting on a couch and seeing the entire length of the couch. Now, I don't know whether you've tried that, but and I blinked. Now, you're used to trusting your senses about what reality is. And if I look down and I don't see my body, I can say, interesting hallucination, but from a materialist point of view, you're getting very close to the edge at that moment, you know. And I think that was the moment that I panicked, what is known as bad trip. And I was about to scream for help when the interesting thought ran through my whatever was left. But who's minding the store? I mean, if all of this is gone, what's left? And I experienced something left that had nothing to do with any of my social roles, with my personality as I knew it, with my body. All the things I had known from outside in, known objectively, knowing myself as object, were gone. What was left was, all I could experience was isness. Right? And I felt this incredible sense of release, as if I have just found, I can't even say myself, I found I. And I went into ecstasy, which we know what it looks like from the outside of, we really have a serious case here, because I ran out into the snowstorm and I was rolling in the snow in ecstasy, which was a great release for me. And interestingly enough, a little later, it was the big snowstorm of the winter in Boston. I went home a few blocks to where I was visiting my parents for the weekend. And I arrived at around 5:30 in the morning, and I decided I was feeling very much like a young brave in the tribe, and there was walking through the snow, and I took a shovel to shovel the walk, as any young brave would do, to shovel the way to the cave before the elders woke up. It was about 5 in the morning, and I saw my parents' faces at the window, and my mother said, "Come inside, you idiot. Nobody shovels snow at 5 in the morning." And I realized that that was the voice I had always listened to. That's how I became a Harvard professor. And I realized that I heard the voice, I understood her values in saying it, and I also saw that it was perfectly all right to shovel snow. I wasn't waking people up, and it was a beautiful thing to do. It was merely her middle-class Jewish values, which I appreciated and honored, but I didn't have to live by. So I went on, I waved at them and shoveled snow, and I heard them saw them turn to each other with that kind of thing of, he's probably drunk. You know? Indeed, I was. Later, I saw the issue very clearly at a moment when I was in the hospital room with my mother as she was dying. This was several years later. She was on morphine and I was on mescaline. And we met in a space in which we had transcended mother and childness and death. We were merely present beings, aware of the entirety together. We were just sharing space. And to me, it was one of the rare and beautiful moments with my mother when we had broken out of the tremendously overriding role structures which we were strongly identified with. And her statement the next day was, when I came in, I said, "Wasn't that wonderful yesterday?" She said, "They gave me some drugs. I was out of my mind." And I saw what the cultural predicament is, that when something new happens, Uspensky said it beautifully. He said, I found that the chief difficulty for most people was to realize that they really heard new things. That is, things they had never heard before. They kept translating what they heard into their habitual language. They had ceased to hope and believe there might be anything new. And in a way, that was the predicament. My mother was reducing this new relationship into out of my mind, into an aberrant behavior, into a pathology. Now, the power of that experience, as you can imagine, made me all too eager to explore further. And that, of course, led to us becoming a cult and all kinds of things with our drug work. Because I realized that what Tim said to me in Mexico after he had taken psilocybin was, he said, I learned more in these 6 hours than I learned in all my career as a psychologist about the human mind. And I couldn't resist that exploration any more than he could. And in a way, I was addicted not to the drug and not even to the rapture and the pleasure, because it wasn't all rapture and pleasure. I was addicted to the opening to an understanding of what a human being was about, because that's supposedly what I was doing as a psychologist. And I was finally doing it. And during those times of drug experimentation, there were experiences which were many of which I didn't interpret at all, many of which I said were ineffable, indescribable. And then there were others which raised presented interesting experiential data about how one is identified with one's body. For example, taking a psychedelic and finding oneself up in the ceiling, looking down on the situation where I was on the floor and I was with a woman next to me. We were holding each other, and I was watching both of us from overhead and seeing parts of our bodies that I would not see from being next to the person, and seeing things that later I verified were true about the back of her head, which I hadn't thought I knew. Okay, I'll leave the door open. And seeing from me up there down to my body a luminous blue cord. Now, I can say, well, that's pretty weird hallucination. Or I can say, is it conceivable that who I am literally was separated from my body, and I am not an identity with my body, and that maybe I was experiencing what later I learned to call an astral body, and that body had separated from the physical body. Was that possible, or was that all? Because in those days, words like God and astral and things like that were really no-nos in my vocabulary, even in my thinking process. They were somewhat obscene. I had done what I had started to do, and what was very reassuring to us, since at that point, interestingly enough, I was working on the blueprints for the office space for the new social relations department in the William James building at Harvard, which was a very funny thing, because here we were being put down by the staff for doing what William James was talking about, who was an old nitrous oxide sniffer. And William James had said in this very, very old chestnut of a quote, but I think it's worth us reconsidering because he is a very revered philosopher and, in a way, a grandfather of a lot of what we do these days, and is coming back into vogue in the annual review of psychology, I noticed. Or I'm told, I didn't notice. He said, our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. We may go through life without suspecting their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus, and at a touch, they are all there in their completeness. Definite types of mentality which probably somewhere have their field of application and adaptation. No account of the universe in its totality can be final, which leaves these other forms of consciousness quite disregarded. But how to regard them is the question, for they are so discontinuous with ordinary consciousness. Yet they may determine attitudes, though they cannot furnish formulas, and open regions, though they fail to give a map. At any rate, James concludes, they forbid a premature closing of our accounts with reality. And we as psychologists are often plagued with the fact that the things that may interest us are regions that exist, but we don't have maps. And we as psychologists must work with maps, with cognates, with symbols of things. And when we can't get hold of them, we are very much like the drunk looking for the watch under the street light, and somebody comes along and helps them, as you know the story, and they look, and there's no watch, and finally the helper says to the drunk, where did you lose the watch? And he says, I lost it up in that alley. Well, why are you looking here? Well, there's a light here. And that we measure what is measurable rather than going into the alley because it's too dark and we can't get hold of it conceptually. Now, during this period of 5 years of my research on myself, my exploration with psychedelic chemicals, what I experienced was going up and down very dramatically, which in the jargon of the street was called getting high and coming down. And we all became, better living through chemistry, masters of how to get high. We knew how to get high to... We even knew how to get high to different levels of consciousness or different kinds of perceptual realities. We could get high to the point where colors changed and they became more intense. Remember Aldous Huxley saying the reason we like jewels so much is they remind us of pebbles on astral planes in which we've lived in the past. And I know how chemically to take you to that place. I mean, it was somebody came in and you said, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to meet God, or do you just want to have super sensual experiences so your sex is better? Or would you like to see dragons and demons? Or which way would you like? Would you like reality to melt? Because we'll use this, or we'll double the dose of that. Right. Now, what were we playing with? Were we merely playing with more and more complex hallucinations, or were we actually extricating ourselves, which it seemed through overriding the chemistry at the synapses, and this is all speculation, we still don't know how it works, that perhaps we were overriding our traditional patterns of thought that were in a way like a prison that limited the definitions of who we were and how we saw the world. In other words, going out of our constructed mind, if you will, in order to experience ourselves anew in different ways, and experience ourselves meaning the universe in a different way, the projection outward in a different way. And the predicament was that you would experience, for example, place. I remember having the first experience with Madison Presnell, who was a black psychiatrist that was on our staff. And I had always grown up as a middle-class liberal Jew who had no prejudice against black people, right? With the quotes that you're not supposed to have, you don't have, that kind of thing, because after all, you're a Jew and everybody doesn't like Jews, so you don't have any prejudice. So I was a very liberal person, whatever that means, but it was a head trip. There was still a place in me that was uptight. And when Madison and I took psilocybin together and I looked at Madison, at that moment I saw another being just like me. It just happened he was wearing a different color skin than I was. And at that moment it freed me from the latent prejudices that we cover and cover and cover and cover. And those prejudices have never returned to this day. It's interesting. It just turned out to be irrelevant. And up until then, I had done my best to appear as an unprejudiced liberal person, which are the worst kind in a way. That's the worst kind of prejudice. It's the scariest kind, and it's the kind we can't get rid of, even though we are well-meaning. It's the prejudice of well-meaningness, which those of you that have been the object of prejudice know the horror of that, where you're hitting against a wall that just doesn't give way because there's no way that the person can admit to it. My problem with going up and down was that I found it extremely difficult to control the levels of my consciousness and always have it together at the right time on the right plane. And not only that, but when I would experience some higher states where I would look and I would see that everybody was indeed another being like me, my brother and my sister, then I would come down into a space where I would again see people as objects to be manipulated for my own convenience and pleasure. In other words, and I would be horrified at who I came down into. And it's interesting that in work with psychedelics, there are two bad points on the journey that are what are called critical moments. Interesting enough, one is going out and the other's coming back. The going out is when you have to let go of who you thought you were, and many people are frightened of that. And the other horror is coming back to who you thought you were after you have tasted of what innocence is about again. And those are two horrible moments in psychedelic journeys for people that don't like the way things are now or are afraid of change or of the unknown. To give you an example of not being able to keep it quite together, I had taken LSD one day during the day out at Half Moon Bay with the ocean. That evening I was to deliver a lecture at the committee in San Francisco. And I had miscalculated my timing a little bit. And I found myself up on the stage where I had been brought. But as I looked out at the audience, all I saw was ocean waves. I didn't see any people. And I couldn't figure out why I was there. Knowing I had no possible way of giving a lecture, I said, "Are there any questions?" And a fish in the fourth row raised its hand. And it stood up with a vest and tie and jacket, and it said to me, "Could you comment on the role of the hypothalamus in psychotropic drug ingestion?" And I saw the mouth moving as a fish do, and at the level I was at, what I experienced this fish saying to me was, "Do you love me?" You see? To which I answered, "Yes, I love you." See? To which he answered, "That doesn't satisfy me at all." Okay. Now, And that's an interesting example. You see, was he really asking, do you love me? It's an interesting reflection about what the game of intellect is about. Are you there? Do you care? Will you care enough to give me what I'm asking for? So on. But it wasn't the level. I was not being what Don Juan calls an impeccable warrior, which means you learn how to play at each level appropriately. You notice here I am in a tie and a jacket. You're not, you slobs, but I'm at the APA meeting. See, and I'm playing my part. You can run down this organization, but I'm not going to. Now, one of the symptoms of concern that started to present itself to me was that I found my mind becoming more and more empty. As a, quote, intellectual of sorts, my thinking process was my stock and trade. And now I found myself thinking less and less about anything. And I would find these periods when my mind would merely be nothing, empty. And I will admit to the fact that at that point I thought, gee, I think I am finding what drugs did to me. Maybe all those people that were saying, be careful, were right, and maybe I have burned out my cortex, and that I'm turning into a vegetable. The fear exacerbated the problem. When somebody would say, when I look at something, I think, what's that? Because the empty mind made me assume that I had forgotten what that was. And the confusion, the fear would increase the confusion, and I would not be able to recognize something. And I decided that I was losing my mind. Later, I began to notice that when there was not fear in the situation, that though my mind was empty, when something was necessary, it was available. And I was beginning to learn how you didn't have to constantly recite what you knew in order to know you know all the time, continually. There's a man, there's a woman, there's a light, there's a chandelier, the rug, the audience, I'm giving a lecture. It wasn't necessary to keep doing this to everything you looked at, to keep labeling it like glass like with a child. We learned it so well we can't stop. We're like drunks, with our power of our intellect, of our prefrontal lobes. That's the siddhi, the power that humans have, and we're drunk with it. And we can't stop. We can't stop reciting and conceptualizing everything. So we don't have any innocence anymore, because we can't ever see anything the way it is. If there were anything out there to see, we can only see what our concepts allow us to see, which is very short shrift. And I began to appreciate that I could walk down a street without defining who I was or who anybody else was or how things were, and start to trust the way that it would all be all right. It's very interesting that we do such incredibly complex acts like driving automobiles primarily on base brain. We make centrifugal and centripetal decisions of incredible complexity as we hurtle through space in 4,000-pound pieces of steel. We make all these decisions while we're looking out the rearview mirror for a policeman, and we're listening to the radio, and we're thinking about where we're going, and we may be making love or whatever we're doing, and give no thought to this stuff anymore. And the idea that we could put more and more of everything on base brain. If I'll take you right to the end of the lecture at the beginning, I'll say, if I can say to you that even as I'm giving this lecture, there is merely giving of the lecture. And if I am anything, I am not the giver of the lecture, I just am. And this lecture is happening. And if you can understand how you just drive, but if I said to you, who are you? You would probably not say when you're driving a car, I'm a driver. You can begin to understand what it means not to identify with being the actor. Okay, we'll come back to that in a little while. Is everybody with it? Is this all right? Are you? Now, the next problem that I had to face in myself was that I experienced myself as more as the witness or standing back from experiences, even while the experiences were happening. It's like having a fight with somebody in which you are totally lost in the fight, versus the moment where you are fighting and at the same moment there's another part of you saying, it's really quite a fight, isn't it? Now, as a psychologist, as a psychotherapist, my immediate interpretation of that is dissociative defense mechanism. You're afraid of the fight, so you pull back into a place where you're watching it. You pushed away the identification with the emotions in order to protect yourself. This is exactly the same kind of reductionistic thinking that Freud got caught in interpreting religion as sexual sublimation. Same one. It's understanding everything only from a pathological model. When in fact what seemed to be happening was that I was starting to live more or less simultaneously, or at least in shorter sequential bursts, on more than one plane of consciousness at a moment. So that I found myself becoming less identified with my emotional states and my psychological qualities and characteristics, and perplexedly enough, at the same moment, more involved with them. I seemed to be living more fully in the moment of the feelings, and yet at the same moment being more spacious around them. And this is the beginning of the paradoxes that we must face. And the concept of paradox, I'm not going to give it technically, but it's that two things are inconsistent with one another. That's a gross statement of it. That they can't coexist simultaneously. That is within one logical system. But it turns out that things that exist on other planes of consciousness or other planes of reality are often paradoxical to one another, as you will see. And this was the beginning of that experience for me. If I saw myself only as having a horizontal personality, and there is an emotional experience over here, and I am also standing over here, I am somehow separating myself from this experience, and within the psychological domain, it can reasonably be called dissociation. If you can consider a vertical axis as well as a horizontal axis in terms of planes of consciousness, I am simultaneously being on the plane of consciousness of awareness at the same moment I am involved in living life. Right? Now, I will admit that during those years, and for many, in fact, from 1961 until about 1975, I was caught in what is very familiar in the religious traditions, which was the denigration of the physical plane psychological existence, psychological, social, physical existence, and the attempting to, quote, get high, or get into the spirit, or get into purer and purer realms, somehow seeing physical reality as somehow gross, dirty, base, away from God somehow. It's the sacred, profane polarity, if you will. And I was very much caught in that one. Somehow it was a little better to be in the place of unity with all things than to be stuck in your own paranoid separateness. Now, in the 60s, I became very attracted to Eastern philosophy. Reason being that what I was experiencing, for example, I think it was Aldous Huxley that introduced us to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, although I'm not sure, introduced him to it. And I remember having a psychedelic experience and finding myself reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead for the first time a few days later, and finding a description of what I had just experienced a few days before, which I had described as ineffable. And here was a 2,500-year-old book read to people as they were dying that was describing this experience, which led us to think of the psychedelic experience as a psychological death-rebirth experience, and led us to, not my experience, but all of us collectively, to put out the psychedelic experience book based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And that ultimately led me to go to India, because I couldn't figure out by 1966 how to get high and stay high. I kept coming down, and I didn't know why. And I knew that as I looked at all the leading researchers in psychedelics, and by then it had all gone underground because of the political scandal and the street scene. So we were all doing research quietly with chemicals we got illegally. And we went on because we felt it was the most important research we could do, even though NIMH wouldn't acknowledge our existence. We realized the risk, and we decided to play it. And you could say, well, they were addicted cult or whatever you want to say, but I'm sharing what we experienced at that moment. And I went to India because I realized that we didn't know enough, and that I didn't see anybody that did. And I realized that there were a lot of maps in Eastern philosophies and religions describing what was happening to us. And maybe even though I couldn't read the maps because I didn't have the cultural context from which to read them, I might be able to find some key or somebody. And in fact, I was very, very blessed, and I did. And I found a being in India who I realized very quickly represented as a statement of possibility what I had dreamed was possible through my exploration of psychedelic drugs. Here was somebody who I knew him from 67 to 73 in his body before he died. There was no place, no plane of consciousness I ever went to that he wasn't there waiting for me. There was no way that these weren't integrated in his being. There was nowhere where he was holding on to any stance of perception. And in order to undercut my attraction to the psychedelic chemicals, which I was using as my main method, he proceeded to take about 4 times the natural dose for an adult male. And it's a very powerful chemical, and nothing happened to his consciousness at all. Because whatever I did, I took this thing in order to go from A to B. He was already A and B, and so his taking it was nothing at all. And the humor of it was that the first time he took it, he was not sure. What happened was he took it, and it happened so quickly that I thought maybe he threw it over his shoulder instead of taking it, because I couldn't accept the fact that nothing happened. But still, he seemed to have taken it and nothing happened. And I went and I told people that nothing happened, but I wasn't sure. And when I went back in 1970, he said to me, "Did you give me some medicine last time?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Did I take it?" And I said, "Well, I think so." He says, "Well, what happened?" I said, "Nothing." He says, "Go away." Called me up the next day. He said, "You got any more of that medicine?" "Yes." "Bring it." So I brought it, and I had 5 pills. He had taken 900 micrograms the last time. And there were 5 pills, 300 each. One was broken. He wouldn't take that. He took the 4 that weren't broken. And he took each one, he stuck it on his tongue like that. And they melt very quickly, so I knew it was in there. And he was looking at me like, now you see that I'm taking it, you see. And then he said, "Will it make me crazy?" And I said, "Probably." And he took water, and then he went under his blanket, and he came up looking insane. And I thought, what have I done to this poor old man? I mean, he didn't realize how powerful they were. He can probably read minds, and he knew I doubted him, and so what have I done, and the karma and all that. And then when I had really gone the trip in my mind, he just laughed at me. And he said, these have been known about. He said, you got anything stronger? And he says, these have been known about years ago, thousands of years ago. These were known about in the Kulu Valley. They're useful. They can be useful. And later when we asked, how are they useful, Maharaji? He said, he was about 80 years old, apparently, at that time. He said, if you take them when you're peaceful and when your mind is turned towards God and you're in a cool space and you're alone, in a cool place, he said it would allow you to come in and have the darshan, the visit of Christ, meaning living spirit. But he said you could only stay 2 hours, then you have to leave again, which means coming down, which is my big problem. He said it would be much better to become Christ than visit him. He said, but your medicine won't do that for you. He said, love is a much stronger medicine than your medicine. During this time, my concepts of time are changing as well. The part of me that is in time, meaning my body, which is growing old, obviously, my personality, which is different than my personality as a child, all those things which are changing qualities, all of my individual difference matrices are seen as packaging, not as essence. And my identity is more and more with essence, and essence seems to have less and less to do with time. So that what I am experiencing more and more is being in the moment, not in the moment in terms of relation to past and present, because they're all here too, but that, quote, nothing is happening. And there is an Eastern statement saying, you do nothing and nothing is left undone. And more that is the experience. You are resting in your whatever you are, which we could call awareness, and out of all that, action is happening. Whatever is happening is happening. But your identity is not with your individual differences. Now, as your consciousness of yourself changes, so your consciousness, your perception of everybody else changes as well. And as psychologists, this is kind of relevant, because that's what we're doing. We're looking at each other. And when you look at someone else, if you are preoccupied, as you know, motives affect perception. If you are preoccupied with your body and with your desires regarding body, which is called lust in the Bible, what you experience are people's physical bodies, longer, shorter, taller, thinner, fatter, thinner, bald, hairy, woman, man, etc. And if you're a scientist, you see endomorphs, ectomorphs, and mesomorphs. And if you're just horny, you see makeable, competitor, and irrelevant. And most everybody's irrelevant most of the time. And as you get older, more are. If, on the other hand, who you see yourself as is primarily psychological, then when you look at other people, you see happy, sad, achiever, power tripper, social roles, policeman, lawyer, mother. You see all of these different things. And if you're a scientist, you look at everybody and you see an MMPI profile. You see manic depressive and hints of hysteria and so on. And those are both matrices of individual differences. They're both different planes of perceptual reality, by the way. And it's very hard for people to communicate across planes. People that stand in the corner watching all the girls go by all the time aren't very interested in their personalities. That isn't what they're noticing. And if you talk to them about a world made up of personality, it's somewhat irrelevant to them. Now, if you flip the screen of receiving again by seeing yourself in a different way, you suddenly look out and the whole thing's turned mythological. And you see 12 beings and permutations thereof. And you see there's an Aries, and there's a Leo, and there's a Sagittarius. You see an astral matrix of individual differences, which is another one, and we're finally getting that one so that we can talk about it. We can even begin to measure it. It's all becoming almost legitimate to think about it. It's another matrix of a reality. And, oh, I see the way you're tilting your head. You're obviously a Virgo. That time. If you flip the dial once more, what you see when you look into the eyes of another human being is another being just like you looking back at you. It's why the eyes are, strangely enough, called the windows of the soul. And the statement, are you in there? I'm in here. How the hell did you get into that one? And you see all of the matrices of individual differences as white shirt, pattern shirt, red. You see it as packaging. If you flip the dial once more, what you see when you look at another person is like two mirrors facing each other. You see yourself, seeing yourself, seeing yourself, seeing yourself, and you realize that there is only one of us in drag. And if you would like a reference for that, I would give you Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. 74, yes. Which for the uninitiated means, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Which means at that moment you have experienced the fact that we are all one, and it's only a big game that we are playing, that we are the many. And that's equally as real as this one is. These are all relatively real. And the minute you have moved out of any one, the minute you move from your body to your personality, you already broke out of the model you had that it was all just one reality. You moved into appreciating different levels of reality or different kinds of reality. And if you happen to turn the dial once more, then you have entered into the one, and in the one there is no two and there is no one. It is zero or the void or whatever you want to call it, or the formless or the unmanifest, and the you disappear and that which you're looking at disappears, and you have just transcended dualism. You've gone beyond the I-thou of Martin Buber at that point.
This podcast is brought to you by the Love Serve Remember Foundation and ramdas.org. We appreciate you listening, and we appreciate all the support that you've given us. Please continue that support and donate at ramdas.org. We can then continue to share what Ramdas has been sharing for all of these years. Thank you.